There it hangs, suspended in gloom, glowing dimly in darkness. A beacon there to inform us that there is always a way out. But don't go just yet. We have such wonderful things to show you. This is the Exit Light Podcast. Hello there. You are once again listening to the Exit Light Podcast. I am your storyteller, Eli Beals. Tonight, I am happy to bring you a fresh story that will be included in Volume 2 of the Exit Light collection, when I get around to compiling it, of course. But I am shooting for, perhaps, Halloween. Yeah, that sounds right. The future is never guaranteed, though, I suppose. The past, however, remains. And this story is one that calls back the wild ones that gave their parents at least 12 hours a day to themselves, only to return like feral cats for dinner and maybe a firm scolding for ruining their shoes. That generation was less surveilled, less constrained, and less likely to see 30 for the most part. Yes, there was danger, more or less the same danger that exists at any time and place, but maybe a little danger was good for us. So, without more ado, I present my story, titled Ronnie. They sat in the shade of an almond tree, atop a pile of moldering railroad ties, eating ice cream that seemed to melt faster than they could consume. They didn't know it, but they would be the last generation that knew what it was like without leashes. Their parents long ago stopped having heart attacks when they came home scuffed, bruised, and sometimes bleeding from their adventures. But if they had returned a mere minute past when the street lamps came on, they faced a reckoning that to them was worse than death, being grounded. As long as that rule was obeyed, they were allowed to roam like wild animals for most of their summer break. Much of the time they spent along and near the railroad and the endless groves of nut and stone fruit trees. No matter how far they strayed, they would always come back to the parallel steel rails that would lead them home. Kevin finished his Garfield-themed treat before his friends and jogged over to the rails and crouched down, setting his ear to the hot metal. From the shade, the other two boys watched in anticipation. "Anything?" Maynard yelled, his mouth stained purple from his rocket pop. Kevin did not respond for a while, and then sprung to his feet and ran back to them. "It's coming," he said, grinning, as if to confirm his statement. Unmistakable sound of a train horn in the distance. If they had known or cared what time it was, they would know that this train had passed through their area nearly every day at noon. But when time was measured by only day and night, this fact would have no meaning, and to them, 5th grade was 1,000,000 miles away. They heard it again, this time closer. "Come on, stop babying that thing, Oscar. Train's coming." Kevin prodded the dark-haired boy's shoulder, who merely frowned. "I'm savoring it," he said defensively. "Savoring it for what? Later? Put it in your pocket then," Maynard said. "Not saving, savoring. Oh, heck." The remaining blob of ice cream plopped to the rocks at his feet, to the amusement of his friends. "Oh well," Kevin said, smiling at his friend's misfortune. "There it is," Maynard pointed, and they all forgot about the ice cream. Together they bounded from the shade of the tree to stand in the path of the approaching train, It was still not more than bug-sized, moving slowly around a curve. They knew that as soon as its last boxcar was clear, then it would begin to accelerate. Kevin dropped once again to listen to the rails to hear its heartbeat. "It's speeding up," he said, and stood. He wondered how long he could stay right there before leaping away to avoid being splattered on the engine's face. He wasn't crazy, but every time he did this, he found himself tempting the idea a little bit more. Maynard and Oscar were already backing away down the gentle slope of crushed rose quartz to a safer spot. "Come on, Kevin. What if he stops because you're standing there? Don't be stupid," Oscar shouted. Kevin nodded and joined his friends after gazing a moment longer at the approaching engine and its long tail of cars. When it got close enough for them to see the cabin windows, they began to wave their arms wildly, shouting and hooting. Then, as if rehearsed, they made a gesture, as if pulling a cord above their right shoulders in unison. Then let them fall in defeat as the engine rushed by them in a gust of hot exhaust-infused wind. As if in farewell, the train bellowed out a single blast from its deep-throated horn, followed by 3 short bursts. The boys cheered and jumped about as it passed in the blur of alternating earth-tone colors. "Finally, he saw us," Oscar yelled over the rumble of the freighter. "Woo! Yeah, that was cool," Maynard exclaimed. "Who's that?" Kevin said, pointing to a figure approaching from across the tracks. "Dunno. Hey!" Oscar waved at what looked like a kid about their age, but wore clothes that reminded him of his parents' old school pictures. Oscar also was the proud owner of many second-hand items passed down from his older siblings' wardrobe, so he understood. For a moment they just looked at each other, waiting to see who would introduce themselves first. Then Maynard said, "What's your name?" The other kid just shook his head and tapped his ear. Maynard figured that he was hard of hearing or deaf. He stepped forward and said loudly, gesturing to the best of his ability to clarify his words, "I'm Maynard. This is," he pointed to his right, "Oscar. And that is Kevin," he said, pointing to Kevin, then aimed his finger at the new guy with a questioning look. The newcomer smiled, amused at the effort Maynard was making, and responded by uttering his name that after a couple of tries they discovered was Ronnie, and that he was completely deaf. Since they didn't know sign language, they communicated mostly in gestures and sometimes writing words with a stick into the dirt. The trio had become a quartet, and were soon considering their next venture, which the new guy supplied in earnest. Ronnie pointed at a radio tower and mimed a climbing motion that had them all suddenly excited and maybe a little apprehensive. "No way, dude. It's locked. Plus, look at how high that is. I'm not going up there," Oscar said, shaking his head vehemently. Ronnie gave him a pitying look and then tapped his own chest, as if to say he would do it. They humored him, only up until he began to climb the chain-link fence that gated off the ladder which pierced upwards through the structure's center. They realized that he was serious about this stunt, and that he intended to climb to the top. True to his word, Oscar stayed firmly outside the clearly marked off-limits area, which he tried to point out to Ronnie, who was then using that very sign as a foothold to get over. Kevin and Maynard followed after, hoping to convince him he didn't have to do this. Ronnie outpaced them, fearlessly climbing as far as the ladder allowed, and hollered into the open blue sky. Kevin stopped climbing when he realized how high up he was. Looking down made his stomach clench, and he gripped the bars tighter. Suddenly too scared to go higher, and terrified to go back down at the same time. Maynard called up to him, saying he was going back down, but he didn't respond, trying to get his equilibrium back. When he looked up again, he saw that Ronnie was hanging off the side of the tower with his back to the breeze, taking a leak from the very top. Kevin couldn't help but laugh at this, and soon forgot he was afraid. I mean, look at Ronnie. He's having a blast, he thought, thankful that the breeze was preventing him from getting rained on as he began to climb back down. When Ronnie at last returned to Earth proper, they all looked at him in admiration, in spite of their misgivings. Ronnie smiled proudly and mimed that was the best piss he had ever taken, and laughed in his off-tune way that at first was off-putting, but exhibited so much glee that it was more infectious than anything else. By this time, the sun was beginning to dip into the far horizon, and they knew it was time to head home. Ronnie just smiled and waved as he went back in the opposite direction across the tracks from where they saw him first. They wondered where he lived, what school he went to. Not theirs, they were certain of. They knew that kids like him had to take special needs classes and were not often accepted into the fold. As far as they were concerned, he was just different, and perhaps a little crazy, which led to the theories that he was part of a circus or his family were all daredevils like Evel Knievel. They also began to think up what other stunts Ronnie would do in the coming days and weeks ahead. Kevin, for some reason, thought of the train. Nearly every day afterward, they would greet the train in its passing. Sometimes it would let loose a series of blasts from its horn, and sometimes not. But every time it passed, Ronnie would be there to cross the tracks to meet them. Their usual antics were somehow upped a few notches with him around. He would do things none of them would have even considered, perhaps going a little too far. Like the time he found a tractor parked in the almond orchard. Searching its various cubbies and panel boxes, he found the keys and promptly started it up. Not really knowing how to operate it, he did manage to crash it into a stack of crates full of harvested almonds. When the farmer returned, he was furious and made them fill the crates back up, but not without some grudging payment of a huge bag of freshly roasted almonds. Another time they encountered a large snake, which they prodded with sticks and ran away whenever it would coil up and lash at them. To them it was a vicious dragon, but in reality it was a terrified gopher snake. Ronnie once again took it to another level, and despite their collective admonishment, grabbed the snake by its tail and ran around with it as it tried to loop itself around to bite him. Eventually he let it go without harm, and they watched it slither away into a large stand of reeds near a creek. On the last week of their summer break, a week they never thought would come, would be their most memorable. Ronnie, as usual, joined them after the train had passed. They never journeyed beyond the train bridge that was about a mile down the track. Once or twice they had set foot on it, but it gave them the feeling of being trapped and worried about another train coming while they were on it with nowhere to go. Since then, they just considered that bridge the border of their territory. Kevin decided that this would be their mission, should they choose to accept it. However, Ronnie, for the first time, showed a moment's hesitation. It was clear that he did not want to go there. In fact, they realized that any time they began to meander in that general direction, Ronnie would intervene, insisting always that there was something more interesting elsewhere. As they walked, they caught sight of what looked like an abandoned camp, and for a while this distracted them from their goal. "A hobo camp," Oscar said, as they poked around the various items scattered around a long, extinguished campfire. Aside from a pile of foul-smelling articles of clothing and tattered sleeping bags, there was not much of interest, and they proceeded onward, only to realize that Ronnie was gone. Maybe he kept going to the bridge, Kevin said, thinking it probable that Ronnie simply wasn't aware, due to his condition, that they had veered off to investigate the hobo camp. The other two nodded in agreement, and they hurried to catch up with their friend. They began calling his name until it occurred to them that he would not be able to hear them, and also realizing with increasing dread that if he was on the bridge, he would not be able to hear an approaching train as well. At this they ran until the bridge was in sight, and sure enough, there he was, about 3/4 of the way over the long span that arced over the wide channel below. Without hesitation, they sprinted towards him, waving their arms, trying to get his attention. About halfway across, they saw him stop and turn towards them. It was impossible to see his expression from that distance, but they could tell something was wrong. His usual roguish demeanor had deflated in a manner that made them suddenly uneasy. His shoulders slumped and his head bowed. Then he lifted an arm up and pointed at the far bank just beyond the other side of the bridge. After a moment he jerked his head up, and even from far away they could see that his mouth had opened unusually wide, a gaping chasm that preceded the long wail of a train horn. Except that the sound did not come from Ronnie. It came from behind them. Their hearts dropped into their stomachs as they gazed at each other with certainty. Another horn blast compelled them to run away from the direction it was coming, towards Ronnie. But as they turned back to where he stood, they were shocked to see that he was no longer there, but sprinted onward regardless. They could feel the ground trembling as the train advanced. They knew from its rhythm that it was moving fast and would not be able to slow down for them. So they ran faster, tears mixed with sweat streaming back across their cheeks. Another blast of the horn bellowed behind them like some terrible beast hot on their heels. 20 paces, then 10, then 5. They were almost clear. Kevin and Oscar dove to the right while Maynard went left, and they all felt the wind rush at their backs as the train barreled by. The two of them got to their feet, eyes wide and charged with adrenaline. They tried to peer through the gaps between cars to see if Maynard was okay. An agonizing half-minute passed before they saw him standing on the other side of the track looking down at something. Maynard turned to face them. His features were hollow and deeply troubled. "Guys, look down there." He pointed to a figure huddled against a concrete slab overgrown with moss as if resting. It was little more than a skeleton, the flesh having long ago rotted away. The mouth hung open wide, barely held in place by desiccated tissue, its empty eye sockets staring into the sky as if howling at the heavens. The fact that they were seeing a real human corpse did not quite sink in. What had them in wide-eyed wonder was that the body was dressed in the exact same clothes that Ronnie had been wearing. Writing allows me at times to revisit my childhood, and while Ronnie was indeed a real person I had met one summer long ago, I cannot in certainty say that he was not a ghost as well. To support this show, I ask that you simply give it some likes or a review, anything to boost the signal. But at the same time, I kinda like being obscure. Thanks for joining me. Until next time, good night.